Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Danny Thomas walks onto the Tonight Show stage, carrying a small wooden collection box, the kind used to raise donations at church fairs, and sets it down on Johnny Carson's desk without a word of explanation. Danny Kaye, sitting in the guest chair beside him, goes completely still the moment he sees it, because he is the only other person alive who knows exactly what that box represents and what it cost both men to finally bring it into the light. But before we dive in, quick reminder, double-check that you're subscribed, since a lot of you think you already are and aren't. It's free, and it really helps the channel. Thank you for being here. The Tonight Show was recorded that afternoon in the fall of 1978, before a studio audience of roughly 300 people at NBC's Burbank studios. The broadcast set to air to nearly 19 million Americans later that night. Danny Kaye and Danny Thomas had come on together, an unusual pairing that Johnny Carson had specifically requested after learning the two men, despite decades of overlapping careers, had never actually appeared on the show together before. Johnny opened with his usual warmth, curious about the friendship itself. "You two have known each other, what, 30 years?" Johnny asked. "How did that happen?" Danny Thomas answered first, his voice carrying the easy warmth that had made him one of America's most beloved entertainers. "Longer than that, Johnny," he said. "We met doing benefit shows back when neither one of us could fill a room on our own name alone. Had to team up just to get people through the door." Danny Kaye laughed at that, the sound genuine and unguarded. "That's generous," Danny said. "What actually happened is I couldn't fill a room, and he could, and he let me ride his coattails for about a decade before anybody knew my name either." Wait, do not miss this detail, because as the audience laughed along with the exchange, Danny Thomas reached down beside his chair and lifted a small wooden collection box onto the desk between himself and Johnny, setting it down with a deliberateness that immediately shifted the energy in the room. Danny Kaye's laughter faded mid-breath. Johnny Carson glanced at the box, then at both men, sensing correctly that this was not part of any script he had been given. "Danny," Johnny said, looking at Thomas, "what's that?" "What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened next, because the story behind that small wooden box reached back 26 years, to a desperate prayer made in a Detroit parking lot in 1952, and a promise that would eventually reshape both men's lives in ways neither had planned. 1952 had been a breaking point for Danny Thomas. His career, after some early success, had stalled badly, bookings drying up, bills accumulating faster than work could cover them, and a young family depending on income that had simply stopped arriving with any reliability. Danny had grown up Catholic, deeply devoted to St. Jude Thaddeus, the patron saint of hopeless causes, a devotion his own mother had instilled in him during an equally difficult childhood spent in a Lebanese immigrant household in Toledo, Ohio, where faith had often been the only reliable constant through repeated financial hardship. One night, sitting alone in his car in a nearly empty Detroit parking lot after yet another booking had fallen through, Danny Thomas prayed in a way he later described as more desperate than any prayer he had offered before, promising that if his circumstances turned around, if he found a way to provide for his family and build the career he believed he was meant to have, he would build a shrine to St. Jude, something that would help desperate people the way he felt he was being helped in that exact moment. He had exactly $7 in his pocket that night, a detail he mentioned so consistently across decades of retelling the story that friends eventually stopped being surprised by the specificity, understanding it had simply burned itself permanently into his memory. His career did turn around, dramatically and quickly enough that Danny Thomas himself later called it impossible to fully explain through ordinary professional luck alone. Within 2 years, he had a hit television show, steady work, and financial security his family had never known. But the promise from that parking lot sat unfulfilled for years, mostly because Danny Thomas could not settle on what form it should actually take. A literal shrine felt insufficient somehow, disconnected from the kind of hopeless causes he had been praying about that desperate night. He consulted several priests during this period, none of whom offered guidance that fully satisfied him. And for a stretch of nearly 3 years, the unfulfilled promise became something Danny Thomas later admitted he actively avoided thinking about too directly, uncomfortable with how much time had passed without meaningful progress. It was Danny Kaye, during a long conversation backstage after a benefit performance in the mid-1950s, who first heard the full story of that Detroit parking lot, a story Danny Thomas had shared with almost nobody outside his immediate family up to that point. The two men had been waiting together for nearly an hour for a delayed second show, and Danny Thomas, uncharacteristically candid that particular evening, found himself telling the whole story almost involuntarily, later saying he had simply needed to say it aloud to someone outside his own family for the first time. Danny Kaye, listening carefully, asked a single question that Danny Thomas later credited as the spark for everything that followed. "What's the most hopeless cause you can actually picture helping?" Danny Kaye asked, not symbolically, but literally. Something real people are facing right now that nobody else is fixing. Danny Thomas did not have an answer that night, but the question stayed with him for years, surfacing again and again during quiet moments, until it eventually crystallized into an idea neither man had originally imagined. A hospital built specifically for children facing diseases considered essentially hopeless by the medical standards of the era. A place where families would never be asked to pay for treatment, regardless of their financial circumstances. The idea took shape gradually across the late 1950s, refined through repeated conversations between the two men whenever their touring schedules happened to overlap. Danny Kaye consistently pushing Danny Thomas to think bigger, more concrete, more permanent than the vague shrine he had originally envisioned in that Detroit parking lot. Danny Kaye, once Danny Thomas shared this evolved vision with him, committed immediately and completely, using his own considerable celebrity to help raise the earliest rounds of funding, appearing at events, making calls, leveraging every relationship his career had built specifically in service of a hospital that did not yet exist and might never have existed without both men's persistent, quiet effort across the following years. Friends of both men later said Danny Kaye's involvement in those early fundraising years was considerably more hands-on than his public reputation for effortless charm might have suggested, involving long nights reviewing budgets and architectural plans that had nothing to do with entertainment at all. The two men agreed early on, in a conversation Danny Kaye later described as one of the most important of his entire life, that neither of them would ever publicly frame their involvement as charity in the traditional sense, that the entire point was removing any sense of obligation or debt from the families who would eventually walk through the hospital's doors, and that meant, by extension, neither man discussing his own personal motivations too loudly in public, keeping the focus entirely on the children and families being served, rather than on either celebrity's individual generosity. Back in the Burbank studio, Danny Thomas rested his hand gently on top of the small wooden collection box. "This was the very first donation box we used," Danny Thomas said, his voice thick with an emotion the audience had rarely heard from him in decades of comedic performances. "Before we had a building, before we had a single doctor on staff, before most people believed a hospital like this could actually exist without charging desperate families money they didn't have. We passed this exact box around at maybe a dozen small events in 1955 and 1956, mostly filled with change and a few crumpled dollar bills from people who had almost nothing themselves but wanted to help anyway." The audience had gone completely quiet, sensing they were witnessing something considerably larger than the light banter that had opened the segment. Johnny Carson leaned forward at his desk, his easy hosting rhythm entirely set aside. "Danny," Johnny said gently, "this is about St. Jude's, isn't it?" Danny Thomas nodded, his eyes visibly wet. 26 years since that parking lot," he said. 22 years since we opened the doors in Memphis. And I don't know if I would have found my way from a desperate prayer to an actual hospital without the man sitting right here asking me exactly the right question at exactly the right moment." He turned to Danny Kaye. "You asked me what hopeless cause I could actually picture helping. I didn't have an answer that night, but I never stopped thinking about the question, and eventually it turned into the only thing I've ever done that I'm more proud of than any show or any film." Danny Kaye's own composure, famous for its warmth but rarely this openly emotional in public, gave way entirely. "I didn't do anything except ask a question," Danny Kaye said, his voice breaking. "You're the one who turned a parking lot prayer into a hospital that's treated thousands of children who would have had nowhere else to go." "That's not a small thing," Danny Thomas said. "Sometimes the question is the whole beginning of everything. You gave me somewhere to point 26 years of guilt and gratitude, instead of just carrying it around unfocused for the rest of my life." The studio held its breath. Nobody applauded right away, because what had happened was too large, too tender for the usual sounds a television audience makes in response to anything. Several audience members were openly crying, moved by the unguarded sincerity of two men known primarily for making people laugh, sitting together and discussing something considerably more permanent than comedy. Ed McMahon, visibly affected, said quietly from his position beside the desk that in all his years on that stage, few moments had captured quite so clearly what could happen when one person's desperate promise met another person's willingness to ask the right question at the right time. Johnny Carson reached across his desk and rested his hand briefly on the small wooden collection box between them. "Danny," Johnny said, looking between both men, "thank you both for showing us what 26 years of following through on a promise actually looks like. If a story like this moves you even a little, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who need them. And I want to ask you something specific. Think of a promise you made once, maybe in a difficult moment, that you're still working to keep, or one you finally did keep after years of trying, and drop just one word describing what that promise was about in the comments below, so we can see how many of us are carrying promises like that." The Tonight Show ran 9 minutes over its scheduled time that evening, and NBC's switchboard stayed lit well past midnight, donations pouring into St. Jude Children's Research Hospital directly as a result of the broadcast, a surge the hospital's own development office later said was among the largest single-night increases in the institution's history up to that point. Letters arrived for weeks afterward, many enclosing small personal donations reminiscent of the original collection box itself, spare change, and modest bills from viewers who wanted to be part of something they had watched unfold with such evident sincerity on their television screens. Danny Thomas and Danny Kaye remained close collaborators on behalf of the hospital for the remainder of their lives, appearing together at fundraising events whenever their schedules allowed, though neither man ever again discussed the Detroit parking lot story quite so extensively in public as they had that single night on Johnny Carson's stage. When Danny Thomas passed away in February of 1991, Danny Kaye, though himself in declining health by that point, insisted on attending the funeral, and was reportedly seen afterward holding a small wooden box, a careful replica of the original, that hospital staff had quietly prepared as a gift once they learned the story behind that Tonight Show broadcast years earlier. If this story moved you, think about the promises in your own life still waiting to be fully kept. The ones that started as a desperate hope in a difficult moment and are still slowly finding their way into something real. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. And before you go, hit that like button if this one got you. It really does help. Then drop a comment and tell me, is there a promise you made once that you're still working to keep? Just tell us what it was, however small. Let's remember them here together.